The wind howled across the Montana Badlands as Jake Matthews sat on his cabin porch, nursing his third cup of coffee and wondering how much longer his savings would last. The isolation he'd craved after hanging up his bounty hunter badge was becoming a luxury he couldn't afford. Then the Mustang appeared, a magnificent black stallion with scars that told stories, standing motionless in his yard like it owned the place. What Jake didn't expect was the leather pouch tied beneath the horse's belly, hidden so carefully that only someone with his trained eye would notice. Inside, a hand-drawn map marked with symbols he recognized from his manhunting days, the calling cards of the Valdez gang, the same outlaws he'd tracked through these mountains 15 years ago before they vanished with a fortune in stolen gold. The Mustang snorted and pawed the ground, as if urging him to follow. Jake's heart pounded as he studied the map's faded ink. Could this wild horse have survived all these years, carrying the secret to the gang's lost treasure? And why had it come to him now, when he needed it most? Jake set his coffee cup down with trembling hands, his weathered fingers tracing the familiar markings on the aged parchment. The Valdez gang had been his white whale, the one case that got away, the failure that haunted his dreams, and ultimately drove him to this remote cabin where he thought he could forget. 3 bank robberies, 2 stagecoach heists, and the murder of a federal marshal. They disappeared into these very mountains, with enough gold to buy half of Montana territory. The stallion stepped closer, its intelligent dark eyes fixed on Jake with an intensity that made his skin crawl. A jagged scar ran from the horse's left ear down to its muzzle, while rope burns marked its legs, evidence of a hard life that somehow hadn't broken its spirit. Jake had seen those same kinds of scars on men who'd survived things they shouldn't have. Standing slowly, Jake approached the magnificent beast, speaking in the low, soothing tones he'd learned from his Cherokee grandmother. "Easy there, boy. Where'd you come from?" The Mustang allowed him to examine the leather pouch more closely. The hide was old but well preserved, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected it from the elements. Someone had taken great care to ensure this map would survive. The symbols were definitely Valdez gang markers. Jake had spent enough sleepless nights studying them to recognize the crude drawings anywhere. A twisted tree marked the starting point, followed by a series of rock formations and what looked like a hidden canyon. At the map's center, a large X was surrounded by the Spanish words Oro de Sangre, blood gold. Jake's mind raced back to that final pursuit 15 years ago. He'd tracked the gang to the edge of Devil's Canyon before a late spring blizzard forced him to turn back. When the snow cleared 3 days later, he'd found their abandoned camp, but no trace of the outlaws or their stolen treasure. The territorial governor had declared them dead, lost to the wilderness, but Jake had always suspected they'd found some hidden refuge in the maze of canyons and caves that honeycombed these mountains. The Mustang whinnied softly and turned its head toward the distant peaks, where storm clouds were gathering like dark omens. Jake folded the map carefully and slipped it into his shirt pocket, his mind already calculating supplies and routes. The smart thing would be to turn this over to the territorial authorities, collect whatever reward might still be offered, and let someone else chase ghosts through dangerous country. But Jake had never been accused of being smart, and the stack of overdue bills on his kitchen table made the decision easier. His bounty hunting days had left him with a small cabin, a decent horse, and skills that were becoming obsolete in a world increasingly ruled by laws and lawyers instead of guns and grit. This might be his last chance at the kind of score that could set him up for life. The stallion began walking toward the tree line, pausing to look back at Jake with an expression that seemed almost human in its urgency. Against his better judgment, Jake found himself following. The horse led him to the edge of his property, where it stopped and turned to face him again, as if making sure he understood the invitation. "I get it, boy," Jake murmured, studying the animal's scarred hide in the fading afternoon light. "You want me to follow this map? Question is why, and why now?" The Mustang stamped once, then wheeled around and galloped toward the mountains, disappearing into the gathering dusk like a ghost made of shadow and wild dreams. Jake stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of the map against his chest and the pull of an adventure that could either make him rich or get him killed. As the first drops of rain began to fall, he made his decision. Tomorrow, he would saddle his horse and follow the trail that had eluded him for 15 years. The Mustang stood 30 yards from the cabin's front porch, muscles coiled tight as a loaded spring. Steam rose from its dark coat in the cool mountain air, and those amber eyes never left Jake's face. He'd seen plenty of wild horses in his time, but none had ever approached this close to human habitation. Something had driven this one here, something beyond the usual search for water or shelter. Jake set down his coffee and reached for the Winchester propped against the porch rail, not to shoot, but to have it ready. The horse's nostrils flared at the movement, but it didn't bolt. Instead, it took a deliberate step forward. "Easy there," Jake murmured, his voice carrying the same tone he'd used to calm skittish informants back in his bounty hunting days. "What's got you so worked up?" The Mustang's hide was crisscrossed with old scars, some from predator claws, others from barbed wire or rope burns. This was a horse that had seen more than its share of trouble. Jake found himself studying the largest scar, a jagged line that ran from the animal's left shoulder down to its foreleg. Something about the pattern nagged at him, familiar yet elusive. A distant rumble of thunder rolled across the valley, though the morning sky held only scattered clouds. The Mustang's head snapped toward the sound, ears swiveling like radar dishes. Then Jake heard it too, not thunder but hoofbeats. Multiple riders, still miles away but closing fast on the old deer trail that wound up from the valley floor. The Mustang wheeled toward the approaching sound, then back to Jake, as if trying to communicate something urgent. Its behavior reminded him of a dog attempting to lead someone to danger or discovery. But wild horses didn't act like this. They ran from humans, from trouble, from anything that threatened their freedom. Jake's instincts, honed by years of tracking dangerous men across hostile territory, began sending up warning signals. He'd chosen this remote location precisely because it was off the beaten path, where past enemies couldn't easily find him. Now riders were approaching, and this scarred Mustang had appeared as if to herald their arrival. The horse pawed the ground with its front hoof, gouging deep furrows in the hard-packed earth. When it turned its head, Jake caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. Branded into the horse's right flank was a symbol he recognized, a broken arrow crossed with a lightning bolt. It was the mark of the Crow's Nest Gang, a group of outlaws he'd helped scatter to the winds 8 years ago. Most of the gang members had ended up dead or behind bars, but their leader, Marcus Black Eye Donovan, had escaped justice. The man had sworn vengeance against everyone who'd brought down his operation, and Jake had been at the top of that list. If this horse bore the Crow's Nest brand, it could only mean one thing. Donovan was still alive, and he'd finally tracked Jake down. But why would the horse come to warn him? Wild Mustangs didn't choose sides in human conflicts, unless this particular horse had its own reasons for wanting to see Donovan fail. The hoofbeats grew closer, perhaps 20 minutes away now. Jake made a quick decision. He stepped down from the porch, moving slowly to avoid spooking the Mustang. The animal watched him approach but held its ground, those intelligent amber eyes seeming to weigh his intentions. "If you're trying to tell me something, boy, I'm listening," Jake said softly. The Mustang snorted and shook its massive head, then did something unexpected. It turned and trotted toward the tree line, pausing after a dozen steps to look back at Jake. The message was clear: follow me. Every rational thought told Jake to stay put, gather his gear, and prepare for whatever confrontation was heading his way. But something about the horse's behavior, the urgency in its movements, suggested there was more at stake here than a simple revenge killing. If Donovan had sent riders after him, why would one of the gang's own horses be trying to lead him away from danger? Jake grabbed his rifle and saddlebags from inside the cabin, along with enough supplies for several days on the trail. Whatever was happening, he had a feeling his quiet retirement was about to come to an abrupt end. The Mustang waited at the forest's edge, pawing impatiently at the pine needles carpeting the ground. As Jake reached the tree line, the horse turned and plunged deeper into the woods, following what appeared to be an ancient game trail. Jake had explored most of the surrounding area during his years of solitude, but this particular path was unfamiliar. It led higher up the mountain, toward terrain so rugged that even the hardiest prospectors rarely ventured there. Behind them, the sound of approaching riders grew steadily louder, but Jake found himself trusting the Mustang's judgment. Whatever lay ahead, it had to be better than facing Donovan's men with his back against his own cabin wall. The hunt was beginning again, but this time, Jake wasn't sure whether he was the hunter or the prey. The Mustang's eyes never left him as Jake worked around the corral the next morning. Every movement he made seemed to register with the animal, ears swiveling to track his footsteps, even when its head was turned away. There was an intelligence there that unsettled him, not the simple awareness of prey watching predator, but something deeper, more calculating. Jake had seen plenty of wild horses in his years riding the frontier. Most were skittish creatures, driven by instinct and fear. This one was different. It studied him with an almost human deliberation, as if weighing his intentions against some internal measure. The brand on its flank bothered him more than he cared to admit. The Circle M mark was clean, professional work, not some crude iron slapped on by rustlers. But Jake had never heard of any ranch using that particular design, and he knew most of the outfits within 100 miles of his hideaway. He approached the fence slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The Mustang snorted, but held its ground, muscles coiled beneath its dark coat like springs ready to unleash. "Easy there," Jake murmured, extending his hand palm up. "Just want to get a better look at that mark." The horse's nostrils flared, testing his scent. For a moment, Jake thought it might bolt, but instead it took a tentative step forward. The morning sun caught the scarred hide along its shoulder, revealing what Jake had missed in yesterday's fading light, a pattern within the damaged flesh. His breath caught. Those weren't random scars from barbed wire or predator claws. Someone had deliberately carved symbols into the animal's hide, crude but unmistakable letters burned deep into the muscle and healed over with time. REDROCK. Jake's hand fell to his side, the blood draining from his face. Red Rock, a name he'd spent 3 years trying to forget, buried along with the life he'd left behind in the dust of a dozen frontier towns. The Mustang nickered softly, almost as if it recognized his reaction. Jake stepped back from the fence, his mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. Red Rock had been a mining claim up in the Sangre de Cristo range, worked by a consortium of investors from back east. He'd been hired to provide security after claimed jumpers started causing trouble. What he'd found there had changed everything. "Where the hell did you come from?" he whispered to the horse. As if in answer, the Mustang turned and walked to the far side of the corral, presenting its opposite flank. Jake followed, dreading what he might see. More scars decorated this side, forming a rough but readable map, lines and X marks that any treasure hunter would recognize. His legs felt unsteady. Jake gripped the fence rail, knuckles white against the weathered wood. The Red Rock mine had collapsed 4 years ago in what the newspapers called a tragic accident. 17 men had died, including the entire surveying team and most of the security detail. The official story was unstable geology and poor engineering. Jake knew better. He'd been there when they found the real reason for digging, not silver or gold, but something far older and infinitely more valuable. The mine had been a cover, a way to legally excavate what the consortium's antiquarians believed was a Spanish treasure vault, hidden away when conquistadors retreated north ahead of Apache raids. They'd found it too. A chamber carved from living rock, filled with artifacts that made strong men weep and sensible men abandon all reason. Jake had been there when greed turned partners into enemies, when civilized investors became killers willing to murder for gold. He'd also been there when it all came crashing down. Literally, the explosion that sealed the mine forever had been his work, his desperate attempt to end the bloodshed and bury secrets, that powerful men would kill to protect. But not everyone had died in that collapse. Someone had escaped, someone who knew what lay beneath Red Rock Mountain. And they'd marked this horse with a map, turned it into a living, breathing treasure chart. The Mustang watched him with those unsettling eyes, as if waiting for him to understand. Jake's mind churned through the implications. If the map was real, if someone had survived and documented the vault's location, then the fortune below Red Rock was still there, waiting. But it also meant they knew he was alive. 3 years of careful hiding, of building a new identity in this remote valley, might all be for nothing. Jake walked to his cabin, retrieved the spyglass from his gear. From the porch he scanned the surrounding ridges, looking for any sign of watchers. The morning remained still, unmarked by dust or movement, but that meant little. A good tracker could observe from miles away with the right equipment and patience. The Mustang had wandered back to the water trough, drinking deeply while keeping one ear cocked toward him. Such a simple creature, yet carrying secrets that could reshape his world or destroy what little peace he'd managed to find. Jake lowered the spyglass, decision crystallizing in his mind. Running hadn't worked before, and it wouldn't work now. If someone wanted to drag him back into that nightmare, they'd picked the wrong man to threaten. It was time to read the map. The Mustang's breathing had steadied by dawn, but its eyes still held that wild wariness that spoke of recent terror. Jack sat on his porch, coffee steaming in the cold morning air, watching the horse pick at the hay he'd scattered near the water trough. 3 days had passed since the animal had collapsed at his door, and each day brought new questions that gnawed at him like splinters under skin. The brand was Spanish colonial, that much he'd determined. The curved lines and careful angles spoke of old money, old families, the kind that had ruled vast ranches when this territory was still Mexico. But what troubled him wasn't the age of the mark, it was its condition. The brand was fresh, maybe 2 weeks old at most, the skin still tender and slightly raised. Someone had taken considerable risk to mark this horse with a symbol that should have been gathering dust in some archive. Jack drained his coffee and approached the Mustang slowly, speaking in low, measured tones. The horse lifted its head but didn't bolt, a small victory that had taken 3 days to achieve. Up close, Jack could see the intelligence burning behind those dark eyes, and something else, a restlessness that went beyond its wild nature. This horse was carrying a burden heavier than any saddle. "What are you trying to tell me, boy?" Jack murmured, extending his hand palm up. The Mustang snorted, but allowed him to touch its neck, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the scarred hide. The scars themselves told a story of violence, claw marks from a bear, the thin lines of barbed wire, and stranger marks that looked almost like rope burns in a deliberate pattern. The sound of approaching horses shattered the morning quiet. Jack's hand instinctively moved to his colt as he counted the hoofbeats. 3 riders, moving fast but not recklessly. The Mustang's ears flattened against its head, and it backed toward the cabin wall, trembling with more than cold. The riders crested the ridge in a cloud of dust, and Jack recognized the lead horse before he saw its rider. Marshal Tom Bridger's roan gelding was distinctive enough, but the star pinned to Bridger's vest caught the sunlight like a beacon. Behind him rode 2 men Jack didn't recognize, one tall and lean with the patient look of a professional tracker, the other broader and younger, his hand resting too casually on his gun butt. "Morning, Harden," Bridger called out, reining in his horse 20 feet from the porch. "Heard you might have found something that doesn't belong to you." Jack kept his expression neutral, though his pulse quickened. "Depends on what you're looking for, Marshal. I find a lot of things up here that don't belong, mostly men running from their mistakes." The tracker's eyes had already found the Mustang, and Jack saw recognition flicker across his weathered features. "That's the horse, Marshal, no doubt about it." "Whose horse?" Jack asked, though he suspected the answer would complicate his life considerably. "Belongs to the Esperanza estate," the younger man spoke up, ignoring Bridger's warning glance. "Been missing for 2 weeks along with the man who stole it." Bridger dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate. "Jack, we need to talk. These gentlemen represent certain interests in Santa Fe." They're looking for a horse thief named Miguel Vasquez, and they have reason to believe you might have encountered his trail." The Mustang whinnied softly, a sound that raised the hair on Jack's arms. He'd heard that name before, whispered in cantinas and around campfires. Miguel Vasquez, treasure hunter, scholar, and according to some stories, the last living descendant of a Spanish family that had hidden a fortune in gold before fleeing north during the Mexican Revolution. "Never heard of him," Jack lied smoothly. "Horse showed up here half dead 3 days ago. No rider, no gear, just a lot of scars and an attitude." The tracker stepped down from his saddle, his eyes never leaving the Mustang. "Mind if I take a closer look? There are markings that might tell us where the horse has been." Jack's blood chilled. The rope burns on the Mustang's hide. If someone who knew what to look for examined them closely, they might reveal more than just evidence of rough handling. He'd seen similar marks before, usually on horses that had been used to carry heavy loads through difficult terrain, the ropes positioned specifically to secure treasure chests or artifact cases. "I mind considerably," Jack said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had kept him alive through 12 years of bounty hunting. "Horse is in no condition to be handled by strangers. You want to examine it, you'll need more than accusations and assumptions." The younger man's hand moved closer to his gun. "We could come back with a warrant." "You could try," Jack replied evenly. "But warrants take time, and winter's coming. A lot of things can happen in these mountains before spring." Bridger stepped between them, his marshal's instincts reading the dangerous current in the air. "Nobody's threatening anybody here. We're just trying to recover stolen property and find a missing man." The Mustang pawed the ground nervously, its eyes fixed on the strangers with unmistakable fear. Whatever Miguel Vasquez had discovered, these men wanted it badly enough to track a wild horse through hundreds of miles of wilderness. And now that trail led directly to Jack's door. The morning sun cast long shadows across the canyon floor as Jake examined the Mustang's scarred hide more carefully. What he'd initially taken for random battle wounds now revealed a disturbing pattern. 3 parallel lines curved across the horse's left flank, too precise to be natural, too deliberate to be accidental. Someone had marked this animal, branded it with something other than the typical ranch iron. The Mustang stood perfectly still as Jake traced the scars with his finger, a behavior that contradicted everything he knew about wild horses. This level of trust didn't develop overnight, and it certainly didn't come from a creature that had never known human contact. "Where'd you come from, boy?" Jake murmured, stepping back to study the horse's conformation. Beneath the dust and tangles, he could make out the lines of good breeding, too good for a typical range horse. The deep chest, the refined head, the way the animal carried itself despite its obvious hardships, all spoke of careful selection and training. A memory stirred in the back of Jake's mind, something about marked horses and hidden messages. During his bounty hunting days, he'd heard whispers of a system used by outlaws to communicate across vast distances. Horses bearing specific scars would carry information between gang members, their movements appearing random to casual observers, but following predetermined routes known only to those in the network. Jake's blood chilled as another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The Cordova gang had used marked horses. He'd tracked 3 members of that crew across 2 territories before finally cornering them near Tucson. One had mentioned something about a scarred stallion carrying the old man's insurance before Jake's bullet had cut the conversation short. Santiago Cordova had been the most cunning outlaw Jake had ever pursued. Where other gang leaders relied on brute force and intimidation, Cordova had operated like a chess master, always thinking 3 moves ahead. When Jake had finally brought him in, the man had smiled from behind iron bars and promised that his legacy would outlive them all. That had been 8 years ago. Cordova had died in prison 2 winters back, but not before sending word through carefully maintained channels that his greatest secret would soon see daylight. Most lawmen had dismissed it as the desperate boasting of a dying criminal, but Jake had learned never to underestimate Santiago Cordova. The Mustang shifted restlessly, ears pricked toward the eastern rim of the canyon. Jake followed the horse's gaze, but saw nothing except rock and scrub brush baking in the strengthening sun. Still, the animal's alertness triggered his own survival instincts. After 12 years of hunting dangerous men, Jake had developed an almost supernatural awareness of being watched. He moved casually toward his cabin, maintaining the pretense of morning routine while his hand drifted closer to his Colt. The Mustang followed, staying close enough to touch, another behavior that would have been impossible with a truly wild horse. This animal had been trained to seek human protection when threatened. Inside the cabin, Jake retrieved his field glasses and positioned himself at the window overlooking the canyon's eastern approach. Through the lenses, he could make out a dust cloud roughly 2 miles distant. 3 riders moving at a pace that suggested purpose rather than casual travel. They'd found his trail. The smart play would be to saddle up and disappear into the maze of canyons that honeycombed this region. Jake knew every water source, every hidden passage, every cave large enough to shelter a man and horse. He could vanish so completely that an army couldn't find him, let alone 3 riders. But something held him back. The Mustang represented a mystery that went beyond simple curiosity. If this horse truly carried information about Cordova's final secret, walking away might mean abandoning the key to something significant. The old outlaw hadn't built his reputation on empty gestures. Jake studied the approaching riders through his glasses, noting their formation and the way they quartered the ground. Professional trackers, not the usual run of drifters or troublemakers. These men knew their business, which meant they weren't here by accident. Someone had sent them specifically to follow the Mustang's trail. The horse nickered softly from outside, a sound that held an almost human quality of urgency. Jake lowered his glasses and considered his options. Flight remained the safest choice, but safety had never been his primary concern during his bounty hunting years. The thrill of the hunt, the satisfaction of solving puzzles that others couldn't unravel, those drives had defined his life before he'd tried to bury them in this remote canyon. Perhaps it was time to stop running from who he'd been and start embracing what he might become. The Mustang had found him for a reason, carrying secrets that men were willing to kill for. In his experience, anything worth killing for was usually worth fighting for. Jake checked his weapons and began preparing for visitors, while outside the scarred Mustang waited with the patience of a creature that understood the ancient dance between hunter and hunted was about to begin. The morning sun cast long shadows across the canyon floor as Jake studied the crude map he'd sketched from memory of the Mustang's scars. 3 jagged lines intersected near what looked like a circular mark, possibly representing the old mine shaft he'd heard whispered about in saloons from here to Santa Fe. The Devil's Backbone Mine, they called it, where a Spanish expedition had supposedly hidden their plunder before Apache raiders wiped them out completely. He folded the paper and tucked it into his shirt pocket, then glanced at the Mustang grazing peacefully near the creek. The horse had settled into an easy routine around the cabin, almost as if it belonged here, almost as if it had been waiting for him specifically. "You're either the luckiest or unluckiest horse alive," Jake murmured, running his fingers along the animal's neck, "carrying around a treasure map on your hide." The Mustang lifted its head, ears pricked forward, and Jake followed its gaze toward the ridge. 3 riders materialized against the skyline, their silhouettes dark and ominous in the morning light. Even at this distance, Jake could make out the purposeful way they moved, scanning the terrain below. Professional, dangerous. His blood went cold. After 5 years of peaceful isolation, his past had finally caught up with him. Jake backed slowly toward the cabin, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt at his hip. The Mustang sensed his tension and snorted, pawing the ground nervously. Through the cabin window, Jake retrieved his rifle and a box of cartridges, then positioned himself behind the water trough, where he had a clear view of the approaching riders. The men descended the winding trail with practiced ease, their horses sure-footed on the rocky path. As they drew closer, Jake could make out details that made his stomach clench. The lead rider sat tall in his saddle, a black hat pulled low over his face, but Jake would recognize that ramrod posture anywhere. Marcus Webb, the man whose brother Jake had killed in that final bloody confrontation that had driven him to abandon his bounty-hunting days. Webb had sworn vengeance that day, standing over his brother's grave with hatred burning in his eyes. "I'll find you, Thornton," he'd promised. "No matter how far you run, no matter how deep you hide, I'll find you." The second rider was younger, probably one of Webb's nephews. The family had a long tradition of producing killers. The third man Jake didn't recognize, but the way he carried himself suggested another professional gunman. They reined in about 50 yards from the cabin, just outside easy rifle range, but close enough for conversation. Webb removed his hat and wiped his brow with a practiced gesture Jake remembered all too well. "Jake Thornton!" Webb's voice carried clearly across the morning air. "Been a long time, friend." "Not nearly long enough," Jake called back, keeping his rifle trained on the group. "What brings you to my corner of nowhere, Marcus?" Now that's not very neighborly. Can't an old acquaintance pay a social call? Webb's smile was visible even at this distance, cold and predatory. "Though I have to say, you picked a fine spot to hide. Took us considerable effort to track you down." "I'm not hiding from anything." "Is that so? Then maybe you won't mind us watering our horses at your creek. It's been a long, dusty ride." Jake's finger tightened on the trigger. Letting them get closer would be suicide, but refusing outright would likely start a gunfight he wasn't sure he could win. 3 against 1, even with the advantage of cover, were poor odds. "Water's free," he said carefully, "but I'd appreciate it if you moved along afterward. I value my privacy." "Oh, we'll be moving along soon enough. Just as soon as you hand over what we came for." Jake's blood ran cold. There was no way Webb could know about the Mustang's markings or their potential significance. Unless— "I don't know what you're talking about." Webb gestured toward the Mustang, which had moved closer to the cabin, as if seeking Jake's protection. "That's a mighty fine horse you've got there. Distinctive markings. Funny thing is, we've been tracking that particular animal for quite some time. Seems it wandered off from its previous owner." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Someone else knew about the treasure map hidden in the Mustang's scars. Someone who'd hired Marcus Webb to retrieve it. "Horse came to me on its own," Jake said. "Finders keepers. Now see, that's where you're wrong." Webb's voice hardened. "That horse belongs to a very important man, a man who doesn't take kindly to theft." The young rider to Webb's left shifted in his saddle, his hand drifting toward his gun. Jake swung his rifle in that direction, and the man froze. "Easy there, boy," Webb said without taking his eyes off Jake. "We're just having a friendly conversation." But Jake could see the calculation in Webb's eyes, the way he was measuring distances and angles. This was about to turn deadly. The saddlebags felt heavier than they should have as Cole spread their contents across his worn kitchen table. 3 leather pouches, each containing what looked like pieces of an elaborate puzzle. The brass fragments caught the lamplight, their surfaces etched with symbols that seemed to dance in the flickering glow. Thunder rolled overhead, and rain began pelting the cabin's tin roof with increasing intensity. The Mustang stood in the lean-to, dry but restless, occasionally snorting as if sensing the significance of what Cole had discovered. He picked up the largest fragment, turning it over in his weathered hands. The metal was old but well preserved, protected by the dry climate and careful storage. Along one edge ran a series of tiny marks. Letters, he realized, though in a script he didn't recognize. Spanish, maybe, or something older. The second piece fit against the first like they belonged together, forming what appeared to be part of a larger disc. When he tried the third fragment, it clicked into place with a satisfying snap, revealing roughly half of what must have been a complete medallion. The assembled pieces showed part of a map, or at least what looked like one. A winding river, distinctive rock formations, and what might have been distance markers. Cole leaned back in his chair, studying the partial image. He'd heard stories about Spanish treasure maps, tales told around campfires by old prospectors and drifters. Most folks dismissed them as fantasy, but holding these pieces, feeling their weight and age, made those stories seem less far-fetched. A flash of lightning illuminated the cabin, followed immediately by a crack of thunder that shook the windows. The storm was directly overhead now, and getting worse. Cole gathered the fragments carefully, wrapping them in a clean cloth before placing them in his strongbox. Whatever secrets they held could wait until morning. But sleep proved elusive. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw faces from his past, men he'd hunted, men who'd hunted him, the badge he'd worn with pride before everything went wrong in Silver Creek. That business with the judge's son had ended his career and nearly his life. 3 years of hiding in these mountains had given him peace, but it hadn't erased the memories. Now this horse had brought him something that could change everything. If the fragments were authentic, if they truly led to treasure, he could disappear completely. New name, new life, somewhere far from anyone who might remember Marshal Cole Brennan. The storm raged through the night, finally exhausting itself near dawn. Cole rose to grey light filtering through his windows and the steady drip of water from the eaves. The Mustang greeted him with a low whinker, steam rising from its coat in the cool morning air. "Morning, partner," Cole murmured, offering a handful of oats. "Looks like you brought me more excitement than I've seen in years." As he prepared coffee, Cole's mind wandered to the practical problems ahead. The fragments were only part of a larger whole. He needed to find the remaining pieces, but where? And who else might be looking for them? The answer came with the sound of approaching hooves. Cole moved to the window, staying back from the glass as he peered out. 3 riders were picking their way up the trail, their horses stepping carefully over storm debris. Even at a distance, he could see they weren't casual travelers. They rode with purpose, scanning the terrain like hunters tracking prey. His blood chilled as the lead rider came into clearer view. Lean build, black hat, the easy seat of a professional gunman. Cole recognized the type even if he couldn't make out the face yet. These weren't treasure hunters or lost travelers, they were hunters, and they were heading straight for his cabin. The Mustang sensed the tension, ears pricked forward and nostrils flaring. Cole moved quickly to the gun rack, taking down his Winchester and checking the load. 6 shots. Against 3 men that might not be enough, but it was what he had. The riders stopped about 50 yards out, close enough for Cole to see their faces. The leader was a stranger, but the man to his right made Cole's stomach drop. Sam Garrett, a bounty hunter from his past, one of the best trackers in the territory. If Garrett was here, it meant someone had put a price on Cole's head. A good price. "Brennan," Garrett's voice carried easily across the clearing. "We know you're in there. Come out peaceful, and nobody has to get hurt." Cole's grip tightened on the rifle. After 3 years of quiet exile, his past had finally caught up with him. But now he had something worth fighting for, not just his freedom, but the promise of a future those brass fragments represented. The Mustang stamped nervously as Cole checked his Colt, making sure it sat loose in its holster. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't go back to face the hangman's noose waiting for him in Silver Creek. Not when he was this close to real freedom. The leather satchel felt heavier than it should have as Jake spread its contents across his rough-hewn table. The dying fire cast dancing shadows over the yellowed documents, making the faded ink seem to writhe like living things. Outside, the Mustang snorted and pawed at the frozen ground, as if sensing the weight of what had been hidden beneath its saddle for who knew how long. Jake's weathered fingers traced the edges of what appeared to be a hand-drawn map, its corners brittle with age. The parchment crackled under his touch, revealing a network of canyons and ridgelines that looked familiar yet strange. Spanish words dotted the margins in careful script alongside symbols that meant nothing to him. But the X marked in bold strokes near what looked like a box canyon that spoke a language every man understood. A second document bore an official seal, though time had rendered much of the text illegible. What he could make out sent ice through his veins. By order of His Catholic Majesty, transport of precious metals, garrison at Santa Fe, betrayal most foul, the date barely visible in the corner, read 1847, just before the Mexican War ended and this territory became American soil. Jake reached for his whiskey bottle, then thought better of it. His mind needed to be sharp for this. He'd heard whispers of such things during his bounty hunting days, lost Spanish gold, Confederate silver, army payrolls that never reached their destinations. Every treasure hunter and desperado west of the Mississippi chased such ghosts. But this felt different, real. The third item made his blood run cold. A wanted poster, more recent than the others, bearing a face he'd hoped never to see again. Marcus Delacroix, the man who'd put the scar on Jake's neck and the limp in his left leg. The poster was dated only 6 months ago, issued by the territorial marshal for murder and robbery. Delacroix was alive, active, and according to the fine print, last seen heading toward the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. These mountains. Jake pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. The Mustang whinnied outside, and he found himself moving to the window. The horse stood alert in the moonlight, ears pricked forward, staring into the darkness beyond Jake's small corral. Something was out there. Moving quietly, Jake lifted his rifle from its pegs above the fireplace. The Winchester felt solid and familiar in his hands as he checked the action. 6 years of peaceful isolation had dulled his edge, but the instincts of a manhunter never truly died. He could feel them stirring now, like embers blown back to life. The cabin's front door opened without a sound. Jake had learned long ago to keep his hinges well oiled. He stepped onto the porch, letting his eyes adjust to the silver wash of moonlight. The Mustang had moved closer to the cabin, positioning itself between Jake and whatever lurked in the tree line. Smart horse. A twig snapped somewhere in the pines, then another. Jake counted at least 2 sets of footsteps, maybe 3, moving with the careful deliberation of men who knew their business. His grip tightened on the rifle. "That's far enough," Jake called out, his voice carrying clear and steady across the clearing. "State your business or ride on." The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, the only sounds were the wind in the pines and the Mustang's nervous breathing. Then a voice emerged from the darkness, smooth and cultured with just a hint of French accent. "Jacob Morrison. It has been too long, mon ami." The scar on Jake's neck began to throb. Delacroix. The name came out like a curse. Should have figured you'd turn up eventually. Laughter drifted from the trees, cold as winter moonlight. "You always were perceptive. That is why you were such an excellent partner, before you developed that troublesome conscience. We were never partners. I brought you in for the law, and you broke out. That's where our association ended. Ah, but circumstances have changed, non? You have something that belongs to me now, something that foolish courier was carrying when he met his unfortunate end." Jake's jaw clenched. So Delacroix had killed for these documents, probably tortured the location out of his victim before finishing the job. It was his style, efficient, ruthless, without a trace of mercy. "Don't know what you're talking about," Jake replied, though they both knew it was a lie. "The horse, Jacob, that magnificent beast beside you. Do you think it coincidence that it came to you? I have been tracking it for weeks, following the trail of its previous owner's blood. Imagine my surprise to discover it had chosen the cabin of my old adversary." The Mustang snorted and tossed its head, scars catching the moonlight. Jake understood now why the horse had seemed so skittish, why it had sought refuge with him. It was running from the same kind of evil Jake had spent years hunting. "Come now," Delacroix continued. "Surely we can reach an arrangement. Partners as we should have been from the beginning." The morning sun cast long shadows across the canyon floor as Jake studied the ancient symbols carved into the rock face. 3 days had passed since he'd first discovered the markings, and each examination revealed new details that made his pulse quicken. The scarred Mustang stood nearby, occasionally snorting and pawing at the ground, as if urging him to move faster. Jake traced his finger along the weathered stone, feeling the deep grooves that time hadn't managed to erase. The symbols formed a clear pattern now, arrows pointing deeper into the canyon, numbers that corresponded to distances, and strange pictographs that seemed to tell a story of hidden wealth. According to his rough calculations, they were close, very close. A distant rumble of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls, causing both Jake and the Mustang to freeze. The horse's ears swiveled forward, nostrils flaring as it tested the wind. Jake's hand instinctively moved to his Colt, fingers wrapping around the familiar grip as he counted the approaching riders. At least 4, maybe 5, moving at a steady pace that suggested they weren't just passing through. He'd known this moment would come. Word traveled fast in the territories, especially when it involved Jeremiah Blackwood and a legendary treasure that men had died seeking for decades. Jake had hoped for more time, but the desert rarely granted such mercies. The Mustang shifted nervously, and Jake placed a calming hand on its neck. "Easy, boy. We've got work to finish first." He pulled out the crude map he'd been sketching, comparing it once more to the symbols on the rock. If his interpretation was correct, the cache lay another quarter-mile deeper into the canyon, hidden in a natural cave system that the ancient carvers had marked with precise detail. The hoofbeats grew closer, and Jake made his decision. He swung onto the Mustang's back, feeling the familiar tension in the horse's muscles as it prepared to run. But instead of fleeing, Jake guided the animal along a narrow ledge that climbed the canyon's eastern wall. If Blackwood's men were coming, he'd rather face them from high ground than be trapped in the narrow confines below. 20 minutes later, Jake watched through a gap in the rocks as 5 riders entered the canyon. Even from a distance, he recognized Blackwood's distinctive silhouette, tall and lean, sitting his black stallion with the rigid posture of a man accustomed to command. The other 4 spread out in a practiced search pattern, their eyes scanning the ground for tracks and signs of recent passage. Jake cursed silently as he realized they were following his trail with disturbing accuracy. One of the riders, a grizzled man with a distinctive limp that Jake remembered from years past, dismounted near the rock face where he'd been working. The man studied the symbols with the careful attention of someone who knew what to look for. "Boss," the tracker called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Fresh marks on the stone. Someone's been reading these carvings real recent-like." Blackwood rode over, his pale eyes examining the evidence. "How recent, Collins?" "This morning, I'd say. Maybe yesterday at the latest. Whoever it was spent considerable time here working out the meaning." Jake felt the Mustang tense beneath him as Blackwood's gaze swept the surrounding canyon walls. For a heart-stopping moment, those cold eyes seemed to look directly at their hiding spot. But the shadows held, and Blackwood's attention returned to his tracker. "Can you follow the trail from here?" Collins knelt beside several hoofprints in the sandy ground. "Horse with distinctive shoes. Front left's got a chip in it. Makes for easy tracking. Trail leads deeper into the canyon, following the same direction as these symbols point." The bounty hunter in Jake analyzed the situation with practiced efficiency. 5 armed men in open ground, with at least 1 expert tracker among them. The Mustang was fast, but the canyon offered limited escape routes, and Blackwood's men could easily split up to cover multiple exits. Fighting wasn't an attractive option either, not against those odds, and not when it would likely result in the treasure's location being lost forever. But Jake had one advantage they didn't expect. The scarred Mustang had been moving through these canyons for years, following paths that no human had mapped. If the symbols were accurate, there was another route to the treasure cache, one that required climbing skills and local knowledge that Blackwood's men almost certainly lacked. As the riders below prepared to continue their pursuit, Jake made his choice. He guided the Mustang along the narrow ledge, moving with painstaking care to avoid dislodging loose stones. The path climbed steadily, following natural breaks in the rock face toward a series of caves he'd spotted during his earlier reconnaissance. Behind them, Collins's voice drifted up from the canyon floor. "Trail's getting fresher, boss. We're gaining on them." Jake allowed himself a grim smile as he urged the Mustang into the concealing darkness of a cave mouth. Let them follow the obvious trail. He had other plans, and time was running short for all of them. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley floor as Jake saddled Thunder, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, despite the tremor of anticipation running through him. The scarred Mustang stood patient beside his own horse, those intelligent dark eyes seeming to understand the gravity of what lay ahead. Marcus emerged from the cabin, rifles slung across his shoulder and saddlebags packed with supplies. "Still think we should have waited for more men," he muttered, checking his weapons one final time. "More men means more witnesses," Jake replied, tightening the cinch, "and more people wanting their share of whatever we find up there." The Mustang nickered softly, pawing at the ground. Jake had spent hours the previous evening studying the burn pattern on the horse's hide, tracing the intricate lines with his finger until the map was burned into his memory. 3 days' ride northwest, past Devil's Canyon, to where the ancient petroglyphs marked sacred ground that white men had rarely seen. They rode out as the dew still clung to the grass, following game trails that wound through stands of pine and aspen. The Mustang took the lead naturally, its gait steady and sure despite the rough terrain. Jake found himself watching the animal with growing respect. This wasn't just any wild horse. There was purpose in every step, intelligence in how it chose their path through obstacles that would have challenged even experienced trail horses. By midday, they'd climbed into country Jake barely recognized. The air grew thin and sharp, carrying the scent of snow from peaks still weeks away from melting. Marcus rode mostly in silence, but Jake could feel his friend's unease growing with each mile that took them further from civilization. "Tell me again why Castellanos wants this treasure so badly," Marcus said, during a brief rest beside a mountain stream. Jake loosened Thunder's bit to let him drink. "Power. Money's just a tool for men like him, but a fortune in Spanish gold, that buys him an army, makes him untouchable. And what's it buy you?" The question hung in the air between them. Jake had been asking himself the same thing for days. Freedom, he'd always told himself. Enough money to disappear completely, to build a life somewhere Castellanos could never reach. But standing in this wild country, watching the Mustang drink from the clear stream, he wondered if he was chasing fool's gold in more ways than one. "A chance to stop running," he said finally. The afternoon brought them to the edge of Devil's Canyon, a yawning chasm that split the mountain face like an old wound. The Mustang picked its way along the rim with sure feet, leading them to a narrow trail that switched back down into the depths. Jake's stomach clenched as he looked into the shadows below. He'd heard stories about this place. Indians said spirits dwelt in the canyon walls, and white men who ventured down alone were never seen again. The descent took 2 hours of careful navigation over loose rock and around massive boulders that had fallen from the canyon walls. The Mustang never hesitated, following what appeared to be an ancient trail marked by occasional stone cairns. Whoever had built this path had known the country intimately. As they reached the canyon floor, Jake noticed the petroglyphs. They started as simple symbols carved into the red sandstone, spirals and animal figures that could have been drawn by any tribe. But the deeper they went, the more elaborate they became. Human figures with elaborate headdresses, strange geometric patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the changing light. And everywhere, horses. Horses running, horses with riders, horses that seemed to leap from the stone itself. "Jesus," Marcus whispered, craning his neck to study a panel depicting what looked like Spanish conquistadors on horseback. "How old do you think these are?" "Old enough," Jake replied, but his attention was fixed on the Mustang. The animal had stopped before a particular section of wall where the carvings depicted a horse with distinctive scars along its flank, scars that matched perfectly with the burn pattern on their guide's hide. The Mustang whinnied once, a sound that echoed off the canyon walls like a summoning call. Then it stepped forward and pressed its scarred side against a specific section of the carved rock. Nothing happened for a moment. Then Jake heard it, a grinding sound, stone moving against stone. A section of the wall, perfectly camouflaged by centuries of weathering, shifted inward to reveal a narrow opening beyond. Cool air flowed from the gap, carrying with it the scent of deep earth, and something else, something metallic that made Jake's pulse quicken. The Mustang stepped back and looked at him expectantly, as if to say, "This is why you followed me." Marcus had gone pale, his hand instinctively moving to his rifle. "That's not natural, Jake. That's what we came for," Jake finished, dismounting. The opening was just wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways. Beyond lay darkness that seemed to swallow their torchlight. The Mustang nickered again, softer this time, almost encouraging. Jake took a deep breath and stepped toward the hidden entrance. The storm hit just as they reached the narrow canyon pass, transforming the world into a howling nightmare of wind and rain. Lightning split the sky in jagged white lines, illuminating the treacherous path ahead for brief, terrifying moments before plunging them back into darkness. Cole pressed himself against the canyon wall, the Mustang's reins tight in his grip. The horse stood steady despite the chaos, its scarred hide glistening with rain. Behind them, the sound of pursuing hoofbeats had vanished beneath the storm's fury, but Cole knew Blackwood's men were still coming. "Easy, boy," he murmured to the Mustang, his voice barely audible over the wind. The horse's ears twitched, responding to his touch with surprising trust. In the brief time they'd been together, an understanding had formed between them, two scarred survivors recognizing something familiar in each other. A flash of lightning revealed the canyon opening ahead, and beyond it, the dark silhouette of Devil's Backbone Ridge. According to the map hidden in the Mustang's gear, the treasure lay somewhere in those twisted rock formations. But first, they had to survive the night. Cole led the horse deeper into the canyon, searching for shelter. His shoulder throbbed where Blackwood's bullet had grazed him during their escape from town, and exhaustion pulled at his bones. The adrenaline that had carried him through the shootout was wearing thin, leaving behind the familiar weight of his past. Another lightning strike, closer this time, and Cole saw it, a shallow cave carved into the canyon wall. He guided the Mustang toward it, grateful when the wind's howling finally dimmed to a manageable roar. The cave wasn't large, but it would keep them dry and hidden. As he unsaddled the horse, Cole's fingers found the leather pouch again. Inside, along with the cryptic map, were three items that made no sense together. A brass compass with strange markings, a small silver locket containing a faded photograph of a woman he didn't recognize, and a letter written in Spanish that his limited knowledge of the language couldn't fully translate. The Mustang snorted softly and nuzzled his shoulder, as if sensing his confusion. Cole studied the horse's scars again in the dim light filtering through the cave entrance. Some looked like rope burns, others like gunshot wounds. This animal had been through hell probably multiple times. "What's your story, boy?" Cole whispered, running his hand along the horse's neck. "How'd you end up carrying secrets worth killing for?" Thunder crashed overhead so loud it seemed to shake the very mountains. In its echo, Cole heard something else, voices, distant but growing closer. His blood turned to ice. Blackwood had found them. Moving with practiced silence, Cole drew his Colt and peered out into the storm. Lightning illuminated three riders picking their way carefully through the canyon, their faces hidden beneath rain-soaked hat brims. He recognized Blackwood's tall frame in the lead, unmistakable even in the darkness. The Mustang shifted restlessly behind him, somehow sensing the danger. Cole placed a calming hand on the horse's muzzle, then made a decision that went against every survival instinct he'd honed over the years. Instead of waiting for them to pass or trying to hide, he was going to end this. The first rule of being a successful bounty hunter was knowing when to be patient and when to strike. In this storm, with the canyon walls creating confusion and the lightning masking sound, he had advantages he might not get again. Cole checked his weapons, the Colt, his backup pistol, and the knife in his boot. 3 men, 3 weapons, the mathematics of violence he knew by heart. But as he prepared to step back into the rain, the Mustang whinnied softly, a sound filled with what almost seemed like warning. He looked back at the horse, struck again by the intelligence in those dark eyes. This animal had survived because it was smart, not just tough. Maybe it was trying to tell him something. Another lightning flash revealed the riders had stopped, probably waiting out the worst of the storm under an overhang 50 yards away. Cole studied their position, noting the way water cascaded down the canyon walls, creating temporary streams that could mask his movement. Then he saw it, a fourth figure, circling wide to approach from the opposite direction. Blackwood wasn't taking any chances. They'd planned this, probably split up at the canyon mouth to trap him between them. Cole's jaw tightened. The storm that had seemed like salvation was becoming his prison. But he'd been in worse situations, and the Mustang's presence somehow steadied him. Whatever secrets this horse carried, whatever treasure waited in Devil's Backbone Ridge, it was worth fighting for. Not because of the gold or jewels that might be hidden there, but because running was no longer an option. The past had finally caught up with him, and there was nowhere left to hide. The cave mouth yawned before them like a hungry beast, its darkness swallowing their torchlight after only a few feet. Jake held the burning branch high, studying the ancient symbols carved into the stone archway, the same spiraling pattern they'd found etched into the Mustang's hooves. "This is it," Elena whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "The entrance Marcus wrote about." Jake nodded, though unease crawled up his spine. Something felt wrong about this place, beyond the natural fear of entering an unexplored cave. The air itself seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and he found his hand drifting unconsciously to his gun. They moved deeper into the tunnel, their footsteps muffled by centuries of accumulated dust. The walls gradually widened, revealing more carvings, images of horses running in endless circles around what appeared to be a central flame or star. Jake paused to examine them more closely. "Look at this," he said, tracing one of the symbols with his finger. "These aren't just decorative. They're telling a story." Elena leaned in beside him, her shoulder brushing his arm. "The horses are carrying something. See those marks on their backs?" Jake squinted in the flickering light. She was right. Each carved horse bore strange markings that could have been packs or riders, but the detail was too worn to make out clearly. They pressed on, following the tunnel as it curved steadily downward. The passage opened suddenly into a vast chamber, their torchlight barely reaching the ceiling lost in shadows above. But it was what lay in the center of the cavern that made them both stop dead in their tracks. A circle of human skeletons sat arranged around a natural stone basin, each one positioned as if they'd been meditating or performing some ritual when death claimed them. Their bones gleamed white in the torchlight, and scraps of ancient clothing still clung to some of the remains. "Jesus," Jake breathed. "What happened here?" Elena moved closer to the nearest skeleton, careful not to disturb the bones. "Look at their hands," she said. "They're all reaching toward the center." The stone basin was filled with what appeared to be water, though it was impossibly clear and still. Jake approached cautiously, holding his torch higher. As the light played across the water's surface, something glinted in its depths. "There," Elena pointed. "Do you see it?" Jake leaned forward, peering into the basin. Far below the surface, almost beyond the reach of their torchlight, something golden caught the flame's reflection. His pulse quickened. "The treasure," he said. "It's down there." But even as he spoke, a chill ran through him. The skeletons around the basin told a clear story. Others had found this place before them, and none had left alive. He studied the bones more carefully, looking for signs of violence, but found none. Whatever had killed these people hadn't been quick or obvious. "Jake!" Elena's voice was tight with concern. "Look at this." She was kneeling beside one of the skeletons, holding something small and metallic. As Jake moved closer, he recognized it immediately, a sheriff's badge, tarnished black with age. "Lawmen," he said grimly. These were lawmen. The implications hit him like a physical blow. How many posses had tracked the treasure to this place over the decades? How many had died trying to claim it? And what force had killed them all without leaving a mark? A sound echoed through the chamber, a low, rhythmic drumming that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Jake spun around, his gun appearing in his hand as if by magic, but there was nothing to see. The sound continued, steady as a heartbeat, and Jake realized with growing horror that it was a heartbeat, or rather, many heartbeats, all beating in perfect unison. "We need to leave," he said, backing toward the tunnel entrance. "Right now." But Elena wasn't listening. She stood transfixed beside the basin, staring down into its depths. Her torch had fallen from nerveless fingers and lay guttering on the cavern floor, but she didn't seem to notice. "Elena!" Jake grabbed her shoulder, shaking her roughly. "We have to go." She turned to look at him, and Jake's blood turned to ice. Her eyes were completely black, pupils dilated so wide that no iris showed. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to come from the stone walls around them. "The water calls," she said. "The gold waits. We must answer." Jake raised his gun, though every instinct screamed against pointing it at her. "Fight it, Elena. Whatever's in your head, fight it." But she was already turning back to the basin, her movements fluid and strange. Jake could feel something pressing at the edges of his own mind, a vast, patient hunger that had waited in this place for longer than human memory. The heartbeat grew louder, and the golden gleam in the water seemed to pulse in rhythm with it. The Mustang's warning echoed in his memory. Some treasures carried too high a price. The morning sun cast long shadows across the canyon floor as Jake pressed his back against the cold stone wall, listening to the echo of hoofbeats growing closer. His rifle felt heavy in his hands, and the metallic taste of fear coated his tongue. Somewhere above, Cortez's men were closing in, their shouts bouncing off the rocky walls like angry spirits. The scarred Mustang stood 20 yards away, its nostrils flaring as it tested the air. The brand on its flank seemed to pulse with significance in the golden light. 3 interlocking circles that had haunted Jake's dreams for weeks. Now, finally understanding what they represented, he felt the weight of 16 years settling on his shoulders like a shroud. "Easy, boy," Jake whispered, taking a careful step toward the horse. "We're in this together now." The Mustang's ears swiveled toward him, but its eyes remained fixed on the narrow entrance to the canyon. Smart horse. It knew they were trapped just as well as Jake did. A rifle shot cracked overhead, sending fragments of stone raining down. Jake dove behind a boulder as more shots followed, the reports amplifying in the confined space until his ears rang. When the barrage stopped, he heard Cortez's voice calling down from the rim. "Jacob Thornfield, I know you're down there. Send up the horse, and maybe I'll let you ride out of here breathing." Jake almost laughed at that. Cortez hadn't let anyone ride away from anything in 20 years. The man collected debts in blood, and Jake's debt was older than most. But it wasn't just about the botched job in El Paso anymore. This was about Don Ricardo's gold, the fortune that had vanished the night the old Don died, along with Jake's partner and any hope of a clean slate. The Mustang snorted and pawed the ground, drawing Jake's attention back to the immediate problem. The horse was agitated, but not in the way Jake expected. Instead of fear, there was something almost eager in its movements, as if it recognized this place. Jake studied the canyon walls more carefully, noting details he'd missed in his desperate flight. The rock formations weren't entirely natural. There were too many right angles, too much symmetry, and that narrow cleft in the eastern wall, barely visible unless you knew where to look. "Son of a bitch," Jake breathed. The Mustang hadn't just led him to a hiding place, it had led him to the treasure itself. More shots rang out, closer this time. Cortez was moving his men into position for a final assault. Jake had maybe 10 minutes before they found a way down, and then it would be over. But 10 minutes might be enough. He sprinted toward the Mustang, moving in a low crouch. The horse didn't shy away this time, standing steady as Jake grabbed its halter. Up close, he could see other markings in its coat, subtle scarring that formed patterns, directions encoded by someone who knew they might not live to share the secret any other way. "Show me," Jake whispered, and the Mustang turned toward the cleft in the rock. They moved together through the narrow opening, Jake leading the horse into shadows so deep they seemed solid. The passage twisted and turned, barely wide enough for the Mustang's shoulders, but the horse moved with confidence as if it had walked this path before. The passage opened into a natural chamber lit by a shaft of sunlight from somewhere far above. And there, Stacked against the far wall like a monument to greed and hope were the leather saddlebags Jake had last seen 16 years ago in Don Ricardo's study. His hands shook as he approached them, memories flooding back. The Don's whispered instructions about a hiding place known only to his most trusted horse. The panic when Cortez's men attacked the hacienda. The desperate flight into the desert that had scattered everything Jake thought he knew about loyalty and survival. The sound of boots on stone echoed from the passage behind him. Jake spun, rifle raised, as a figure emerged from the shadows. But it wasn't one of Cortez's gunmen. It was Elena Vasquez, the Don's daughter, older now but still carrying herself with the same quiet strength he remembered. She wore dusty traveling clothes and carried a Colt revolver with the ease of long practice. "Hello, Jacob," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years and unfinished business. "I wondered when you'd finally come home." Jake kept his rifle trained on her, but his mind raced with new possibilities. "Elena, I thought you were dead." That was the idea. She gestured toward the saddlebags. "My father made sure the story spread, the grieving daughter who couldn't bear to live without her family. Much easier than explaining why she'd vanished the same night as the treasure." The Mustang whinnied softly, and Elena smiled, reaching out to stroke its scarred neck. "He's been waiting for you, you know. All these years, waiting for the man who was supposed to protect us to finally understand." Outside, Cortez's shouts grew closer, but Jake barely heard them now. The past he'd been running from was suddenly more complicated than he'd ever imagined. The dawn air carried the metallic scent of blood as Jake crouched beside the body sprawled in the dirt. 3 bullet holes, tight grouping, professional work. Marshal Thompson's badge caught the first rays of sunlight, a bitter reminder that even the law wasn't safe in this deadly game. "Poor bastard never had a chance," Jake muttered, closing the marshal's unseeing eyes. The Mustang snorted nervously nearby, ears flicking at every sound. Even the horse knew they were sitting ducks out here in the open canyon. A glint caught Jake's attention near Thompson's outstretched hand. A brass compass, its face cracked but still functional. Strange, marshals didn't typically carry civilian navigation equipment. Jake pocketed it, instinct telling him nothing here was coincidence. Sarah emerged from behind a boulder, her face pale but determined. "The tracks lead north toward Devil's Backbone. At least 6 riders, moving fast." She paused, studying his expression. "You know who did this, don't you?" Jake's jaw tightened. The shooting pattern, the precision, the way Thompson had been positioned, it all screamed Castellanos. His old nemesis had a signature style, cold and efficient. "Miguel Castellanos, we have history. The Mexican revolutionary." "I thought he was dead." "So did I." Jake stood, brushing dust from his knees. The weight of his coat felt heavier than usual against his hip. "Turns out we were both wrong about a lot of things." They mounted up quickly, the Mustang seeming to understand the urgency. As they rode deeper into the maze of red rock formations, Jake's mind churned through possibilities. Castellanos hadn't just stumbled onto their trail, he'd been hunting them, probably since Santa Fe. The question was how he'd learned about the treasure. The answer came sooner than expected. At a narrow pass between towering stone walls, Sarah's horse suddenly reared. The crack of a rifle echoed off the canyon walls, and rock exploded inches from Jake's head. He dove from the saddle, pulling Sarah down with him as more shots peppered their position. "Welcome back to the game, amigo." Castellanos' voice boomed from somewhere above. "You always were too predictable, Jake Morrison. Some things never change." Jake pressed his back against a boulder, mind racing. The voice came from the eastern rim, maybe 3 others positioned at different points. Classic Castellanos, methodical, patient, overwhelming firepower. "What's your play here, Miguel? You already killed the marshal." Laughter echoed off the stone. Poor Thompson. He thought he could bargain with information, trade your location for his life. "Foolish man never understood that I already knew exactly where you were headed." The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Thompson hadn't been following them to help. He'd been feeding information to Castellanos, probably for weeks. The compass in Jake's pocket suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds. "The horse, Morrison. Send out the horse and the woman, and perhaps I'll let you live long enough to watch me claim what should have been mine 15 years ago." Sarah caught Jake's eye, her expression fierce. "We're not giving up now. There has to be another way out." Jake studied the canyon walls, memories flooding back. He and Castellanos had played this game before, in different canyons under different circumstances. Miguel always positioned his men the same way, overwatch on the high ground, blocking the obvious exits. But he had a blind spot, a tendency to neglect the least likely escape routes. The crack in the western wall, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. Jake had used it once before, years ago, when a bounty hunt had gone sideways. If he was right, it led to a narrow ledge system that connected to the next canyon over. Another volley of shots forced them lower. The Mustang had taken cover behind the rocks with them, its dark eyes alert and intelligent, almost like it understood the conversation, the stakes involved. "Listen carefully," Jake whispered to Sarah. "In 30 seconds, I'm going to create a distraction. Take the horse and head for that crack in the wall, see it? Don't argue, just go. Follow the ledge system until you reach the next canyon, then ride hard for Willow Creek. I'm not leaving you here to die." "You're not. But that horse is the key to everything, and Castellanos won't stop until he has it. I can hold them here, maybe work out some kind of deal." Sarah's eyes blazed with protest, but she nodded. They both knew Jake was right. Separating was their only chance. Jake checked his ammunition, counting rounds. Enough for a good fight, if not necessarily a winning one. The brass compass seemed to pulse in his pocket, Thompson's final gift pointing toward an uncertain future. "Time's up, Morrison," Castellanos called. "Send them out now, or we come down and take what we want from your corpse." Jake squeezed Sarah's hand once, then rolled away from cover, guns blazing. The canyon erupted in gunfire and echoing shouts as 15 years of bitter history finally came due. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert floor as Marcus crouched behind the weathered outcropping, watching the distant camp through his spyglass. Smoke still curled from their fire, and he counted at least 8 men moving between the scattered tents. Blake's operation had grown since their last encounter. The scarred Mustang stood quietly beside him, ears pricked forward as if sensing the tension in the air. Over the past weeks, the horse had become more than just a companion. It was his partner in this deadly game of cat and mouse. The animal's scars told a story of survival that Marcus understood all too well. "Easy, boy," he whispered, running his hand along the horse's neck. The brand beneath his palm felt warm, the mysterious symbols that had started this entire journey still as cryptic as the day he'd first seen them. But now he knew what they meant. The old Spanish records Elena had helped him decipher in that dusty mission archive had revealed the truth, coordinates to a mine shaft, hidden in the maze of canyons ahead. A rifle shot cracked across the desert, and Marcus dropped lower behind the rocks. Through the spyglass he saw Blake's men moving with sudden purpose, saddling horses and checking weapons. Someone was shouting orders, though the words were lost in the wind. They knew he was here. Marcus folded the spyglass and swung into the saddle. The Mustang responded instantly to his touch, wheeling away from the outcropping and toward the narrow canyon entrance a quarter-mile south. Behind them, dust clouds marked the pursuit beginning in earnest. The canyon walls rose like ancient sentinels on either side as they plunged into the shadowed passage. The Mustang's hooves rang against stone, echoing off the walls in a staccato rhythm that matched Marcus's heartbeat. This was the passage Elena had described, the one that would lead to the hidden valley where Spanish miners had worked their secret claim 3 centuries ago. But it was also a trap if Blake's men reached the far end before he found the treasure. The canyon twisted and branched like a serpent's path. Marcus let the Mustang choose the route, trusting the horse's instincts over his own uncertain memory of the map. The animal seemed to know these passages, picking its way through fallen boulders and around sharp turns with confidence born of familiarity. Behind them, the sound of pursuit echoed off the walls. Blake's voice rose above the clatter of hooves, harsh and commanding. They were gaining ground. The canyon opened suddenly into a circular depression surrounded by towering red walls. Ancient petroglyphs covered the stone surfaces, and at the far end, partially hidden by a rockfall, Marcus saw the dark mouth of a mine shaft. His pulse quickened as he recognized the symbols carved above the entrance, the same ones burned into the Mustang's hide. He dismounted quickly, pulling his rifle and saddlebags from the horse. "Stay close, boy. We're not done yet." The mine entrance was partially blocked by fallen stones, but there was enough space for a man to squeeze through. Marcus lit the oil lantern from his pack and pushed into the darkness beyond. The tunnel stretched ahead, supported by rotting timbers that creaked ominously in the still air. 20 yards in, the passage opened into a natural chamber. Marcus raised the lantern high and felt his breath catch in his throat. The walls were veined with silver ore so pure it gleamed like starlight in the lamplight. Wooden chests sat along one wall, their iron bands green with age but still intact. Spanish colonial treasure, enough silver and worked metal to buy a new life anywhere in the world. The sound of horses entering the valley reached him even through the stone walls. Blake had found the entrance. Marcus grabbed the smallest chest, hefting its weight, too heavy to carry far, but he could manage one. He stuffed loose silver pieces into his saddlebags until the leather strained at the seams. The rest would have to wait if he lived to claim it. Outside, the Mustang waited exactly where he'd left it, ears alert to the sounds of approaching riders. Marcus lashed the chest to his saddle and swung up just as Blake's voice rang across the valley. There, the mine entrance. Gunshots cracked against the stone walls as Marcus spurred the Mustang toward a narrow cleft in the opposite wall. Another passage Elena had mentioned, one that led to the high country beyond. The horse lunged forward as bullets whined off the rocks around them. The cleft was barely wide enough for horse and rider, the walls pressing close on both sides. Marcus bent low over the saddle as they squeezed through, feeling the rough stones scrape against his boots. Behind them, Blake's curses echoed in the valley as his men discovered the passage too narrow for easy pursuit. Then they were through, emerging onto a high mesa with the whole desert spread below them. The wind carried the scent of freedom, and for the first time in weeks, Marcus allowed himself a tight smile. The Mustang tossed its scarred head and broke into a gallop, carrying them toward the distant mountains and whatever new life awaited beyond. The warehouse stood like a monument to decay against the storm-darkened sky, its broken windows staring down at Jake like empty eye sockets. Lightning split the heavens as he dismounted from Scar, the Mustang's flanks heaving from their desperate ride through the night. The letter he'd found at his cabin still crumpled in his pocket. Marcus Caldwell's final message revealing the true location of the Comanchero gold. Jake's breath misted in the cold air as he studied the building. 20 years ago, this had been Caldwell's legitimate freight operation, a cover for his more lucrative smuggling enterprise. Now it was a hollow shell, but according to the letter, the treasure lay hidden beneath its rotting floorboards. "Easy, boy," he whispered to Scar, whose ears twitched nervously at every thunderclap. The Mustang had led him true, just as Caldwell had promised. The brand on the horse's flank wasn't just a mark of ownership, it was a map pointing to this exact location where the Santa Fe and Chihuahua trails converged. Jake pushed through the warped door, wood groaning in protest. His boots echoed in the cavernous space as he struck a match, the flame dancing wildly in the drafts that whistled through broken boards. Rats scurried away from the light, and somewhere in the darkness, water dripped steadily from a leak in the roof. The letter had been specific, 20 paces from the east wall, 15 from the north. Jake counted carefully, his footsteps measured and deliberate. When he reached the designated spot, he knelt and brushed away years of accumulated debris. The floorboards here looked different, newer somehow, despite the decades that had passed. He worked his knife between the planks, prying them up one by one. The wood came away easier than expected, revealing a carefully concealed trapdoor. Jake's heart hammered as he lifted it, exposing a narrow shaft that disappeared into blackness below. A rope ladder, still sturdy despite its age, hung from iron hooks. Jake tested it gingerly before committing his full weight. The rungs held, and he descended into what appeared to be a natural cave system that had been expanded and reinforced. His match guttered out, forcing him to light another in the confined space. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. Wooden crates lined the walls, some bearing Spanish markings, others stamped with military insignia. But it was the scatter of canvas bags that drew his attention, bags that clinked metallically when he nudged them with his boot. He tore open the nearest sack, and gold coins spilled across the stone floor like scattered stars. Mexican pesos, American double eagles, and Spanish pieces of 8, a fortune that represented years of Caldwell's careful accumulation. Jake had seen treasure before, had recovered stolen money for clients across 3 territories, but nothing like this. This was generational wealth, enough to buy land, cattle, a future free from the shadows of his past. But even as he marveled at the discovery, Jake's instincts prickled with warning. The sound that had been nagging at the edge of his consciousness suddenly resolved itself, hoofbeats growing closer, multiple riders approaching fast. He scrambled up the ladder, emerging into the warehouse, just as torchlight began filtering through the broken windows. Voices carried on the wind, harsh and familiar. The Torino brothers, along with what sounded like half a dozen men. They tracked him here, probably followed his trail from the cabin. Spread out came Vicente's gravelly command. "He's here somewhere, and so is that damn horse." Jake cursed silently. He'd been so focused on finding the treasure that he'd failed to consider how exposed this location would leave him. The warehouse offered little in the way of defensive positions, and with Scar waiting outside, retreat seemed impossible. Thunder crashed overhead as the first figure appeared in the doorway. Carlos Torino, silhouetted against the lightning-split sky. His gun was already drawn, and his eyes swept the interior with predatory intensity. "Well, well," Carlos called out, though he hadn't spotted Jake yet. The famous Jake Morrison, finally run to ground in a rat's nest. "Fitting, don't you think?" Jake pressed himself against a support beam, mind racing through his options. The treasure lay 20 feet below, but it might as well have been 20 miles for all the good it would do him if he ended up dead. Scar whinnied nervously outside, and Jake heard Vicente's cruel laughter in response. "That Mustang's been leading us a merry chase," Vicente's voice drifted through the storm. "But every trail ends somewhere. Tonight we settle old debts, Morrison. Tonight you pay for what you took from us." More men filed into the warehouse, their torches casting writhing shadows on the walls. Jake's hand found the grip of his Colt, though he knew the odds were impossible. 6-1, maybe worse, and they had him trapped like a wolf in a canyon. The final confrontation he'd spent 5 years avoiding had found him at last. Here, among the ruins of Marcus Caldwell's empire, with a fortune in gold lying buried beneath his feet. The canyon walls echoed with gunfire as Cole pressed himself against the red sandstone, Luna's reins tight in his grip. The Mustang's sides heaved from their desperate ride through Devil's Gateway, but her eyes remained alert, ears swiveling toward the sounds of pursuit. Behind them, Marshal Hendricks and his posse had finally caught up, their voices carrying on the desert wind like wolves closing in for the kill. "End of the line, Garrett," Hendricks's voice boomed from somewhere above. "That treasure map belongs to the territorial government now. Hand it over peaceful-like, and maybe we can work something out." Cole touched the leather pouch at his side where the ancient Spanish document rested. 3 weeks of following Luna's instincts through hidden trails and forgotten canyons had led them here, to the place marked with the conquistador's seal. The treasure wasn't just gold, it was a cache of Spanish artifacts and precious metals that could fund a man's dreams for several lifetimes. But it also represented something else, the final chapter of a story that began when he'd first seen those distinctive scars on Luna's hide. "Like hell," Cole muttered, checking his ammunition. 6 bullets left in his Colt, maybe 8 rounds for his rifle. Not nearly enough if Hendricks had brought his full posse. Luna nudged his shoulder, then looked toward a narrow gap in the canyon wall that Cole hadn't noticed before. In the fading afternoon light, it appeared to be nothing more than a shadow, but the Mustang's insistence told him otherwise. She'd guided him this far. He had to trust her instincts one more time. The crack in the rock face was barely wide enough for a horse and rider, forcing Cole to duck low as Luna picked her way through the passage. Behind them, shouts erupted as the posse discovered their hiding spot. A bullet sparked off the stone inches from Cole's head, sending rock fragments into his hair. The passage opened into a hidden chamber, and Cole's breath caught in his throat. Carved niches lined the walls, filled with clay vessels, silver crosses, and ornate weapons that gleamed despite centuries of darkness. In the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, and scattered around its base lay dozens of gold bars, their surfaces dulled with age but unmistakably real. But Cole's attention was drawn to something else entirely. Painted on the far wall was a mural depicting Spanish conquistadors on horseback, and in the corner, clear as day, was the image of a scarred Mustang that looked exactly like Luna. Below the painting, Spanish text told the story of a horse that had led the conquistadors to this sacred place, only to disappear into the desert when the natives reclaimed their land. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," Cole whispered, understanding flooding through him. Luna wasn't just any Mustang, she was descended from the very horse in the painting, carrying in her blood and instincts the memory of this place. Her scars weren't from barbed wire or predators, they were ritual markings, passed down through generations like a living map. The sound of boots on stone snapped him back to the present. Hendricks and 2 deputies had found the passage. Cole drew his Colt and positioned himself behind the altar, using the gold bars as cover. The irony wasn't lost on him, making his last stand behind the very treasure they'd all killed for. "I know you're in there, Garrett," Hendricks called from the passage entrance. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. That bounty on your head is worth more to me than any treasure, but I'll take both if you force my hand." Cole's mind raced through his options. The chamber had no other exits, and Luna couldn't fit through the narrow window openings carved high in the walls. They were trapped, unless... He looked at Luna, who was studying the mural with an intensity that made his skin prickle. The Mustang approached the painting and began pawing at a specific spot on the floor. Cole followed her lead and discovered a loose stone. Beneath it lay a mechanism, ancient but functional. When he pulled the lever, a section of the chamber wall groaned and shifted, revealing a tunnel that sloped downward into darkness. "You've been keeping secrets, girl," he murmured, stroking Luna's neck. The first deputy appeared in the chamber entrance, rifle raised. Cole fired twice, driving the man back into the passage. In the confusion that followed, he grabbed what gold bars he could carry, stuffed them into his saddlebags, and guided Luna toward the hidden tunnel. As they descended into the mountain's depths, Cole could hear Hendricks cursing and shouting orders behind them, but the sound grew fainter with each step, and soon there was only the soft echo of Luna's hooves on ancient stone and the whisper of air currents that suggested another way out. The tunnel was leading them home, not to his cabin, but to something deeper. Freedom, perhaps, or maybe just another beginning in a story that seemed determined to write itself. The dawn light filtered through the cave entrance as Jake traced the final symbol carved into the stone wall. His fingers had grown steady over the past hour, following the intricate pattern that matched the scars on Scar's hide perfectly. Each mark told part of the story, a map created by desperate men who knew they were running out of time. 3 steps north from the Eagle's Eye, Jake murmured, reading the ancient markings. Behind him, Scar stamped restlessly, as if sensing they were close to something momentous. The cave had revealed its secrets reluctantly. What had appeared to be random scratches in the rock were actually carefully planned directions, coded in symbols that only someone familiar with Apache trail markers would recognize. The old prospector who'd originally found this place must have learned the language during his years in the territory. Jake followed the directions, counting his steps carefully. The cave floor was uneven, littered with rocks and debris from decades of neglect. His boots echoed in the confined space, each footfall seeming louder than the last. 3 steps brought him to a section where the wall curved inward, creating a natural alcove. 2 arm lengths east, he continued, measuring carefully. The spot he arrived at looked no different from any other part of the cave wall. Smooth stone worn by time and weather, with no obvious hiding places. But the markings insisted this was the location. Jake pressed his palms against the rock, feeling for any give or hollow spaces. At first, nothing. Then his fingers found a slight depression, barely noticeable unless you were searching for it. He pressed harder and heard a soft grinding sound as a section of the wall shifted inward. The hidden compartment was small, just large enough for a man to reach inside. Jake's heart hammered as he felt around in the darkness, his fingers encountering something wrapped in oiled cloth. He pulled it out carefully, surprised by its weight. Under the morning light streaming into the cave, he unwrapped the bundle with trembling hands. What emerged took his breath away, not gold or silver as he'd expected, but something far more valuable. Land deeds. Dozens of them, each one bearing official territorial seals and signatures. Jake spread them out on a flat rock, studying each document carefully. The properties described covered vast swaths of territory that would soon become valuable railroad land. The dates on the deeds were old, filed years before anyone knew the railroad was coming through. Someone had possessed incredible foresight or inside information. "Son of a gun," Jake whispered. The Mustang had led him to something worth far more than buried gold. These deeds represented legitimate ownership of land that the railroad companies would pay handsomely for. Legal claim to territory that would make a man wealthy beyond imagination. But as he examined the documents more closely, Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. Many of the deeds bore the signature of Samuel Hawkins, the man whose death had driven Jake from bounty hunting 5 years ago, the man whose son had sworn vengeance against Jake for bringing his father to justice. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place. Hawkins hadn't just been a cattle rustler and murderer, he'd been part of something much larger, a scheme to acquire railroad land through forged claims and intimidation. The treasure Scar had led him to was stolen property, acquired through fraud and violence. Jake sank down on a boulder, the weight of realization crushing down on him. He'd spent years running from his past, only to have it literally delivered to his doorstep. The scarred Mustang hadn't brought him salvation, it had brought him a choice that would define the rest of his life. Footsteps echoed from the cave entrance, and Jake spun around to see a familiar silhouette blocking the morning light. Thomas Hawkins stepped into the cave, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. The years had aged him, adding lines to his face and grey to his hair, but his eyes burned with the same hatred Jake remembered. "Figured you'd end up here eventually," Hawkins said, his voice carrying the weight of old grudges. "That horse has been leading folks on a merry chase for years. Most never made it past the desert, but you always were persistent, Mac Creedy." Jake's own hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Your father was a killer, Hawkins. I was just doing my job." "My father was building something," Hawkins replied, stepping closer. "An empire that would have lasted generations. You destroyed that when you brought him in to hang." The 2 men faced each other in the cave where it all began, surrounded by the evidence of old crimes and broken dreams. Outside, Scar whinnied nervously, sensing the tension in the air. Jake looked down at the deeds scattered at his feet, then back at the man who'd tracked him across years and miles. The treasure was within reach, but claiming it meant facing the consequences of choices made long ago. The past had finally caught up with him, and there was nowhere left to run.